Greetings. Today we have Dr. Paulo Fontoura, the Global Head and Senior VP, Neuroscience and Rare Diseases Clinical Development at Roche Pharmaceuticals. He received his MD and PhD in Neuroimmunology at the New University in Lisbon, where he was trained as a clinical neurologist, followed by a postdoctoral fellowship research training at Stanford University School of Medicine. His focus was on discovery of new autoantigens and development of vaccines in MS. Thank you for joining us today, and we will start.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah. So the first question to you is, what is neuroscience, and can you give a brief description about your role?
Yeah, of course. I mean, neuroscience is essentially the study of the functioning of the nervous system in animals, right? And specifically in humans, it has to do with understanding the variety of functions that our brains and our nervous systems essentially do for our bodies. Anything from basic motor functioning to higher levels of functioning like communication, abstract reasoning, memory, etc. So it's really a very, very broad field of expertise. And in terms of clinical medicine, then it encompasses, if you want, all the disorders that come from dysfunctioning of the brain, whether those are what we call neurological diseases, so things that are usually associated with the destruction of some brain tissue or loss of some cells, or psychiatric disorders, which are more functional in the sense that usually there's no destruction of the underlying tissue, but there's a malfunction. It just works differently, right? So it's really a very, very, very broad field of clinical medicine. And what I do on a day-to-day basis is that I coordinate and I lead the teams that develop medicines for both diseases of neurology and for psychiatry. So a wide range of things, ranging from Alzheimer's disease or multiple sclerosis to stroke or to psychiatric diseases like schizophrenia, depression, autism, etc.
Yeah, that seems amazing. And the next question is, what interests led you to choose neuroscience, and when did you realize that you wanted to become a neuroscientist?
Yeah, no, it's an interesting question because all of us come at this at different times of our life. I guess while I was studying medicine, I was always attracted to areas of medicine that were more, if you want, they had a bigger scientific problem associated with them. And clearly neuroscience, so the functioning of our brain, for example, is one of the areas of medicine and biology of which we know the least. And therefore, just the scientific challenge was also very, very attractive. And I guess what made me commit to this area was during my medical training when I started to see patients with neurological diseases. Just on one hand, the fact that they're so common, there's so many people that have, for one reason or another, at different stages of their lives, malfunctions or dysfunctions of brain, of their brains and spinal cords. Secondly, the fact that these are diseases that are so personal. So, they rob you of something that's so uniquely human. If you think about somebody with Alzheimer's, right, who's losing their memories and the ability to recognize their family, that's something so deep within all of us that I just felt compelled if I could do something about that. So it was really a gradual process, but I'd say it started when I first started to encounter clinical medicine in the field.
Yeah, that's great. And the next question is, what's the most exciting thing in neuroscience that brings you back to your job every day?
Oh, I think that's easy. It's the opportunity to do really incredible things for these people. As I said, these are, on one hand, such common conditions, right, of the human, of all of us, of humans everywhere around the globe. There's essentially 700 million people worldwide that have neuroscience diseases, if you want. So it's almost like 1 in every 100 persons has a problem. So it's huge. And secondly, unfortunately, there's really not many things that can be done nowadays for them. So that's what brings me back every day, is the fact that I think I'm working on something that has the potential to have a huge impact in human healthcare, in all of our societies, has the opportunity of make life better for a lot of people and their families.
Yeah, that seems interesting. And the next question is, what do you like the least about being a neuroscientist? How do you overcome it and refocus your attention?
I'd say probably what I like the least is that it's very hard. Most things we do fail. We just don't know enough, right? The process of science is slow, and you have to be very patient, right? So we know much more now than we did even a decade ago, but we still know so little. So that means that if you are thinking about having an impact in your science, you cannot think that you're going to do it very quickly. It doesn't happen in a year or 2 years. For example, I've been in my current role at Roche for over a decade, and only now are things starting to bear fruit. So it takes a lot of patience. So that's the biggest thing I don't like, is that you need a lot of patience. You need to be resilient. You need to stay the long course. And then what brings me back, every day is, as I mentioned, the thought that the goal, the objective is so important. It's so important for me, but also for all of us as a society, right? So that just makes me want to come back every day to try and do that.
That was amazing. And the next question is, what are the most challenging and most rewarding parts of being a neuroscientist?
Well, as I said, the most challenging ones are probably to do with the lack of knowledge, and in human research, so in clinical trials, the fact that we have very imperfect ways of actually being able to test the hypothesis and to generate scientific knowledge. For example, it's very hard for us to look inside the brain of a living person to find out what's happening. Now we have tools like functional imaging and things like that, but they're still far away from what the real processes of our brains are. So on a day-to-day basis, that is very, very challenging. Or for example, the way that we measure human behavior, it's still very much based on interpersonal interaction. So me interviewing you and asking you, how are you feeling today? What type of symptoms do you have? So that's great, but from a research standpoint, the type of data you get is not very high quality data. And that means that clinical research, so clinical trials in neuroscience typically suffer from a lot of problems of data quality, of variability from patient to patient, and between researchers. So if I look at you and try to determine what you have and another person does the same, the results will be slightly different. And that, from a scientific standpoint, is very, very challenging, right? Again, what makes it challenging is what makes it super interesting as well, because then it forces you to think, well, how do I solve this, right? So what is it that I need to do now to overcome that problem? And that's why, for example, I'm very keen, I'm very enthusiastic about now the use of new ways of looking at human behavior, such as wearables and digital endpoints and things like that. So using technology basically to be able to explore better the functioning of our brains and the way that we behave.
Yeah, and the next question is, would you say your role requires the ability to work in teams?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, science is the ultimate team sport. And I think, it's time that we kind of gave up that myth of the lone scientist in their lab who makes the big discovery and all on their own, and they go on to win the Nobel Prize. That was maybe 150 years ago. Nowadays, science is the work of teams. You work every day with literally hundreds of people all over the world. That's what I do, and that's what my teams do. Clinical research, because it requires so many different specialties. It requires so many different types of knowledge. People who understand biology, people who understand clinical trials, people who understand the regulatory path, people who understand chemistry, et cetera, et cetera. It's just so complex that it's impossible for any one person to be proficient and to be able to do it alone, right? So working in science, and especially working in clinical science or in clinical research, is the ultimate team sport.
Yes, sir. I agree with that. And the next question is, describe your day-to-day life as a neuroscientist, or what does a typical day look like for you?
Well, now it looks very different than what it used to, right? Because I've done, as you mentioned in your kind of introduction, I've done many things. So when I was in the lab, my day was essentially that of a lab scientist. So it's a lot of interaction with other people, setting up experiments, et cetera, et cetera. Then as a physician, of course, your day is different because you see patients and you work in hospitals and you work in clinics, et cetera. Today, what my day looks like now is that because I'm the global head for a function that has hundreds of people in it, my day is basically spent working with those teams. And these are global teams that have people in the US, in China, in Europe, et cetera, who are running these big clinical trials. And I spend my day essentially meeting with them and working with them to try and help them solve their problems, right? That's also because that's the work of leadership right now. Again, we need to let go of that view that leaders sit kind of above the structure and give commands that everybody follows. Our work is actually to go into the structure and work closely with those teams to help them make progress, because it is the teams, again, science is a team sport, so it's the teams who make progress. So my work in lots of ways is like of a team coach. I try to make them perform as best as they can and put the right players in each team and make sure that when they hit a problem or a roadblock, that I'm there to help them solve it.
And that's amazing. And the next question is, what are the recent researches that are going on, and what impact does it make?
So our efforts right now, as I said, are pretty wide. Okay, my team is working on multiple projects at the same time. Several of them in rather large, if you want, common diseases such as Alzheimer's or Parkinson's or schizophrenia, etc. And some of them, because I also do rare diseases, are working in genetically defined rare conditions, things such as spinal muscular atrophy or Huntington's disease. So these are all very, very exciting things. I'd probably say, in terms of the scale of the impact, right, that on one hand, for big diseases like Alzheimer's, what we hope to do in the next few years, and certainly by the end of the next decade, is to have medicines approved that change how patients progress. So not just they don't treat the symptoms, they actually change the biology of the brain in a way that they don't get Alzheimer's as quickly. Okay. For rare diseases, it's a different situation, because fortunately there we know much more, because mostly they're genetic conditions. So we know which genes are at fault, what's the biological problem, so we can have a much deeper intervention, if you want, and hopefully sometimes cure these diseases. So some of the medicines that we're developing now and that they're coming out now are based on new technologies, such as gene therapy or antisense molecules or gene splicing modifications, etc. And those are really capable of almost curing those diseases as early as we can, diagnose them, which sometimes means we're diagnosing patients now in the pre-symptomatic stage, so before they have symptoms, using genetic testing, etc. So that for those patients, even though they're not very common diseases, right, because they're rare, they don't affect many people, but for each one of them, the impact of this medicine is huge. Sometimes it means they don't die from that disease, or they have almost a normal life because of that medicine. So there's a real variety of things.
That makes a huge impact on lives. And the next question is it impossible to understand the thinking philosophy of human brain? Does it depend on the technology we have access to?
That's a difficult question, because it really depends on what do you mean by the thinking philosophy of the human brain, right? So it's not impossible to understand the basic functioning of the human brain, meaning the way our brains, for example, generate or encode memories, or the ways that our brains generate language and learn how to communicate and to understand other people, or to understand how our brains solve complex problems. like mathematical problems or computational problems. That's not impossible. And actually, we've made a lot of progress in understanding that. When we get to human behavior, things like motivation or affection, emotions, etc., it becomes a little bit more complicated because there's a big subjective element to it. So meaning that you and I can have the same experience, but very, very different emotional results of that experience, right? It becomes more complicated, but again, we've solved already part of that. We know, for example, which parts of the brain are involved, which cells, which neurotransmitters, etc., etc. But now if you take it to the next level, which is you start to thinking more about the meta-functioning, things like, I don't know, philosophy and dreams and ideologies and things like that. I think that's where biology is not going to be enough, because you need then to put on the social aspects, the cultural aspects, because again, we as animals, if you want, humans as animals, we have something unique to us that most other animals don't have, which is we learn from one another and we copy one another's behavior really, really well. And that's actually one of the key things that has led to our incredible development, right? And to what we have achieved now is our ability to learn socially. And that's not something that you can explain by looking at one human brain, because it only happens when you have dozens of people around you, right? So I think there's a level of human behavior that has to do with societies, with social behavior, etc., that's not explainable by understanding. Even if we could understand everything about the human brain, it wouldn't explain that, you know? So there's a big difference. What technology can help us do is not so much, well, it can help us understand social behavior better. And certainly if you look at the work that companies like Google do, right? We can understand social behavior much, much better, or at least how humans behave in large numbers. It doesn't explain the why, the motivation for that behavior, but it certainly explains the patterns of behavior. And I do think that for individual human beings, technology, be that brain imaging or electrophysiology or digital technology, etc., will certainly lead to much deeper insights as to how the human brain is organized and how the human brain then malfunctions.
Yeah, that was informative. And the next question is, what surprised you the most when you work while working on a project?
What? Sorry, what's that?
What surprised you the most when working on a project?
Yeah, again, I think it's the realization of how little we know sometimes. Even in rare genetic disorders where you'd think things are super simple because it's one gene or one protein that's missing, et cetera, and then it seems like an easy, almost like an engineering problem to fix. Even then, the way that our body adapts and changes individually is so different from person to person. Even in genetic diseases, there's such variability that sometimes what you think is a very, very clear hypothesis, is a very clear idea of this is going to work in such and such a way, and then the results really surprise you. I think, again, working in science is not losing that ability to be surprised by nature, right? If we think we know everything, that's when we stop being scientific. The process of science is really the ability to keep questioning and keep asking more questions, because nature really works in very, very mysterious ways sometimes. Even when we think we know everything, that is the most surprising thing sometimes, when after years of research, tons of data, and you have all the genetics and all the animal models and all the biology, et cetera, it still doesn't quite work the way you thought it would.
And yeah, and the next question is, did you change any of your or your family's habits as a result of anything you learned from your studies?
Yeah, no, I think that's that is a really good question, because at the end of the day, science needs to have an impact on society as well, right? So one of the things certainly that I'm very keen on, not so much because of my research, but generally because of research. I mean, our understanding of the fragility of the ecosystem and globally has changed dramatically in the past 2 decades, if you want. So everything that has to do with, environmental footprint and climate change and things like that, me and my family, we've changed a lot of our habits because of that. Because again, we thought that nature was much more resilient than it actually is. And there are, feedback cycles and amplification cycles that we were not aware of, that now even we understand small changes over time or small impacts over time can lead to a catastrophic outcome. For me personally, from my own research, one of the things that is becoming very, very clear as we go on is that a lot of the common diseases of the brain, things like especially neurodegenerative diseases, so diseases where as you age, you start losing brain cells. So Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, those are the common examples, are to a large extent driven by very, very common risk factors that are within our control. So how we eat, if we exercise, how active of a social life we have, how we sleep, etc. All of those very common, almost like basic rules of human behavior are super important. So the fact that, for example, we've changed a number of things for me and for my family in terms of diets and exercise and sleep cycle and the need really to like turn off now, especially now we have so many calls for our attention with electronics and TV and social media, and all those things are useful, but it's also very, very clear they have a negative impact on our brain health. So being aware of that, being conscious that our brains are, again, very fragile organs to some extent, and we need them to last now, not 40 years as we used to 200 years ago. We need them to last 100 years or 120 years maybe for you and for your generation. So we really need to take care of them as the most important organs in our body.
Yeah, that was insightful. And the next question is, over the course of your career as a neuroscientist, have you ever worked on or seen projects in your field that you do not agree with as an individual?
Me personally, I must say, no. I mean, there are aspects of research that have changed, right? There are aspects of research that have changed over time. So it used to be very, very common, for example, when like 20, 30 years ago, to do massive animal experiments, for example, right? And just repeat animal experiments and all of that. I think, fortunately, nowadays, we really recognize that research has to be humane as well, so that, the whole effort to reduce and replace animal models and to stop animal testing as much as possible, I think it is a change, certainly. And when I look back, yeah, there are and were especially types of animal research that I don't think we should be doing anymore, because I don't think it's really sustainable or humane. It's not us at our best. In terms of the types of projects I work for, not so much. I think maybe I've been fortunate because I've been working all my career essentially in trying to improve human health, which doesn't mean you don't make mistakes or you don't look back and say I could have done this differently. But the goals of the projects were always, I think, in the best interest of humankind. It was always to try or to either improve the life of somebody else or to cure disease or to do something like that. So I'd say not.
Okay, that was nice. And the next question is, what would the world be like if there were no neuroscientists?
Oh, I think it'd be much worse. I think it'd be much worse because as I've mentioned, diseases of the brain are so common and so devastating. If we did not do research on them, we would be essentially ignoring one of the biggest causes of disability, pain, suffering that humans have to live with. And this is a problem that it's going to become bigger and bigger. And there's two reasons for that. The first of which is that we're all going to be living much longer lives. Okay. So what used to be true, that maybe you had a life expectancy of 30, 40 years. So who really cared if you got Alzheimer's or Parkinson's or stroke or something like that? That's just no longer true. In large portions of the world, life expectancy is rising extremely fast. And therefore, the number of people that have or will have brain disorders is going to increase exponentially. So for example, we're thinking for Alzheimer's now, that now there's about 30, 40 million people in the whole world. In just 20, 30 years, there'll be 150 million people. By the end of the century, if we don't do anything, it'll be twice that number. So we're talking about huge numbers of people with very significant brain problems, okay? And it's not about them only. It's not only about the persons with the disease, it's then the whole family around, because they all suffer and they have to take care of those people. So the burden on society is going to be unsustainable unless we do something about it. So if there's no neuroscientists working on that, then society itself will have a huge problem on their hands. And the second, that's one piece of it. It's such a big problem. You know, the second part of it is that it is such a human problem, right? I mean, our brains are, the way our brains function, the way that what neuroscience does, if you want, is to work to study the things that make us who we are, that make humans who we are, right? If we don't have our memories, our dreams, our plans, our ability to communicate with others, to engage, to have a social life, etc., then what are we, right? Then we're just animals like any other animal. The things that are unique about us are depending upon a healthy, functioning brain. So if we don't have neuroscientists, we're essentially refusing to study the things that are most important to us, right? So I'd say a world without neuroscientists would be a much, much worse world.
Yeah, yeah. Neuroscientists are essential. And the next question is, what would be the scope of neuroscience in future?
Well, I hope that as we progress and we have better technology, right, we'll go from studying the diseased brain, so just diseases, to start studying the variety of human behavior. All of us are different, right? So not all of us have the same skills or capabilities or talents, etc. And right now, we understand that at a philosophical level. So we understand that at a social and a cultural level, but we don't really understand why. We don't understand why certain people have certain skills and not others, right? I hope at some point we're going to start studying human diversity using the tools of neuroscience. And because that would lead to better understanding of why people are different, I really hope that will contribute to more tolerance of others that are different than us, so that we all understand that regardless of how we look or our gender or our age or whatever, you know, here's what makes us behave differently from one another. And when we do that, I hope that brings us, because understanding usually leads to a better outcome, I hope that understanding then leads to us behaving differently towards one another, right? That we start being nicer to one another and be more tolerant to one another and having more social cohesion, etc. So that's my hope.
That was insightful. And the last question is, what's your advice to the students aspiring to become a neuroscientist?
Well, I'd say, first of all, if you are thinking about it, it's an amazing field of research to work on because of the diversity, the size of the challenge, the fascination with what makes us unique and who we are. So I think that's great. My advice is, on one hand, you need to be prepared that this is a lifelong mission. You need passion and you need commitment, and you need to stay the long term, right? So you need to understand that the only way to make progress is by working on it long enough. It's not an easy problem. It won't be fixed. It's an ongoing thing. It's a lifelong commitment, essentially. So you need to understand that. And so my advice is, if you are thinking about it, you're certainly thinking about an amazing area of research, but you need to be aware of the commitment we're going to be asking of you, which is huge. But at the same time, if you do want to make something important happen in the life of others, I think this is an amazing area of research and science to be working on.
Yeah, that was really great. And sir, would you like to add anything?
No, I just really want to thank you for the opportunity to speak to you, and I hope this helps. I mean, it's great just to see young scientists and young minds becoming interested in research and science. I do think that science is a force that will make the world better. As I think I said, with our understanding of nature, our understanding of other human beings. In my case, our understanding of how the brains of other people work and what makes them function, I think leads to a better society for everybody, to a more understanding, more humane society for everybody. So I really want to encourage all of you who may be watching this to really think about a career in science, because it's a never-ending passion.
That's great. And thank you so much for joining us today. And yes, sir,
My
it was
pleasure.
really helpful and insightful. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Take care.
Have a nice day.
Bye-bye.
Bye.